Good morning.
Good
You're all
morning.
awake. Much ado about something. At my church are two pastors. The primary pastor, who is paid to work for the church, and the associate pastor, who is not paid. The second man, who works full-time as an engineer, is known to most people at the church as the Reverend Daniel J. Metzgar. To me and my siblings, he's known as Dad. Dad preaches the sermon in the Sunday services at least once a month, and more often if necessary. This means that at least one Saturday of every month, my dad, after taking the dog for a walk, sits down at the computer, researches the biblical passages being read the next day in church, and spends almost the rest of the day writing a sermon based on those verses. Assuming he starts preparing for the next day's service at around 9:30 and works until about 5 in the evening, Dad spends an average of 7.5 hours total in preparation for the next day's service, all to create a sermon lasting only 10 to 15 minutes. Why would Dad spend so much time to create something so small? It certainly isn't to talk a lot or hear himself speak, nor is it for the money, because, as I mentioned, he doesn't get paid to preach. If there isn't a financial motivation or an egotistical compulsion, then why does he do this? I talked to my dad about it. He said that the purpose of any of his sermons is, quote, the proclamation of God's word, which includes elements of the law and the gospel to hearers, end quote. When he delivers his sermons, he is trying to, quote, help them, the listeners, hear and believe in the forgiveness of their sins, end quote. So Dad, by giving a sermon, aims to help not himself, but those listening, whom he wishes to assist in finding God. Similarly to how my dad creates a sermon, Martin Luther, in seeking how to gain righteousness, the sword from a biblical parable in working his field, and the typical junior at Northfield in writing a speech, exert a good deal of effort to achieve something seemingly minor, but which is worth all the effort. One person who inspires my dad is Martin Luther because, as my dad said, Luther, quote, wrestled with his conscience until he discovered from the books of Zechariah and Romans that righteousness is not a human work, but the work of God through Christ for us, end quote. Luther, who as a young man went to the University of Erfurt, a great achievement in the 17th century, and earned both his bachelor and master's of arts in 4 years, had a promising future as a lawyer, as his father Hans intended for him. Instead, Luther became a monk in the Augustinian order. During his years there, he grew increasingly worried about the doctrine of justification through works because, as he thought, if Christ is simply a stern judge all too willing to sentence someone to hell, then who measured up well enough to get into heaven? Certainly not himself, he thought. So, during his years as a monk, Luther tried to punish himself mentally and physically as much as possible to make up for his sins, going so far as to endure extreme self-flagellation and long hours on end in confessional. While he was in this tormented state of mind concerning his salvation, Luther also became a priest, doctor, and professor, seeming to everyone to be progressing rapidly for a young man, being only in his 20s when all these advancements occurred. While teaching the scriptures as a professor to university students, Luther struggled to understand this passage from Romans 1:17, the righteous shall live by faith. In describing his experience in retrospect, Luther even stated, I did not love this righteous God who punished sinners. Indeed, I hated him and raged at him with a fierce and disturbed conscience. Nevertheless, I continued to knock impatiently at St. Paul's door, thirsting intensely to know what he meant in this passage. Luther searched the scriptures, trying to understand how to reach God's righteousness, examining the original Hebrew and Greek of the text with the intent of coming to terms with the truth about salvation. Finally, when he was almost 30, Luther discovered something that changed everything. God, quote, justifies us through faith, end quote. A breakthrough that transformed Luther so much that he proclaimed, quote, as much as I had hated this word, righteousness of God, before, now just as fondly I praised it as the sweetest word I knew, so that this verse in Paul became for me the gates of paradise, end quote. After many years of struggle within his soul, Luther realized this doctrine, seemingly small and simple, but in fact spiritually revolutionary. With this knowledge, Luther reread the scriptures in view of this new creed. Later, after a failed attempt to reform the Catholic Church based on his doctrine, Luther reluctantly started a movement away from that church, which attracted so many followers that several influential denominations grew out of this church branch, known as Protestantism. Thus, when Martin Luther realized the deceptively small but actually crucial doctrine of justification by faith, he enabled many others to reach salvation by focusing on grace from God alone. Among the subjects on which my dad has given sermons is a story from the Bible that reflects the idea of working much for small but worthwhile outcomes, the parable of the sower. In this story, a man takes several seeds, goes out to his field, and spreads them in rows in order to grow a crop. He and his family depend on the profits which result from selling the product. But now, that may sound easy, but consider this. The sower walks around his field, which, if it were large, would be quite a walk. On his shoulder, he lugs a bag of seed. Although we cannot know exactly how much this man's burden weighed, today even a small bag of wheat seed weighs 20 pounds. I can only speak from my own experience, but my backpack weighs about 20 pounds when full of books. I get tired of standing around with it on my back after only 5 minutes. A bag of dog food, available at a grocery store, weighs at least 17 pounds, and often more. I usually put one of those on my shoulders and back to carry, instead of holding it in front with my arms because of the combination of its weight and size, and I put it down if I have to hold onto it for more than a minute. So imagine the man carries the heavy bag, full with seed, when he starts sowing. According to Elizabeth Fletcher, a religious educator certified by the University of Sydney with a focus on biblical studies, a sower would, quote, hold the seed bag on his shoulder and drop the seeds to the soil, end quote, where he was planting, as he scatters the seed in preformed rows, similar to how Virgil told his fellow farmers in his work Georgics to plant in rows. He likely grows tired from using his arm and back to disperse the kernels. Meanwhile, as the sower continues to hold onto the bag that hangs off his back, and as he continues working and grows more tired, his bag gets lighter. Finally, when he has finished sowing the seed and emptied the bag, he is exhausted from simply getting the seed onto the ground. Following all this work, most of the seed he has scattered does not grow, some landing, quote, on rocky ground, some along the path, and some among thorns, end quote. None of the above survives very long. Only a small portion of the seed survives, that which, quote, fell into good soil and prospered and yielded 100-fold, quote. The parable uses the seed to refer to the word and plants that grow or do not, to represent those who hear the word. As some of the seed spread by the farmer grows and some of it does not, so too do some of the people who hear the gospel take it to heart, while others do not. Similarly, although my Father does not know in advance who among those who hear his sermon will take it to heart, he preaches in the hope that someone will. All the long, hard work the sower employs in sowing leads to a small end result. Only a few seeds survive, but one which proves its worth by increasing the harvest. None of these examples, at least chronologically, which demonstrate great effort used for a small but worthwhile end result, are the junior speeches. Many of us work multiple hours on our speeches. I myself, probably 20 hours at least, somewhat similar to how my father worked hours on his sermons. All that time is spent in creating sermons or speeches that last about a half hour, that have lasting messages, reminiscent of my father's 10-minute sermons. In order to do this, a student must brainstorm possible ideas or themes to develop. In the process following, one must constantly edit and revise the speech multiple times, and after each drafting, meet to approve the changes with Mr. Coleman, who will most likely suggest even more changes. Finally, the day rolls around when the student gives his or her speech, standing and speaking in front of the whole school. All this work and frustration may be overwhelming. However, keeping the end result in mind is vital to success. As my dad thinks about how his sermon may help someone, I have been encouraged by remembering that I am doing this not only to get a grade, but also to inform the Northfield community on something I find important in order to improve how the members in it think and live. I remember several impressive junior speeches, like when Ashton Birchfield spoke about knowing people not as ideals, but as they are, as the reverse happens in The Great Gatsby, when Jay Gatsby imposes his idea of wealth on Daisy. I particularly remember Ashton touched on C.S. Lewis's concept of inner rings, societies whose membership is built on the fact that they are exclusive. I also remember when Jordan Ennis spoke about serendipity and what he called the receptive eye, the ability to notice the usefulness of an unexpected incident. He mentioned how Steven Spielberg, in filming Jaws, used the fact that his shark models malfunctioned, which thus meant they could not appear on screen, to build suspense by not showing them. If even one small part of my work falls on receptive ears and helps shape whoever hears it, like my dad strives to accomplish with his sermons, I can know that I have done well in my speech. As these examples of my father, Martin Luther, Jesus' sower, and a typical Northfield junior, show their hard work and dedication to their tasks, they reflect the origins of say, in the Middle French, essayer, that is, to attempt. Therefore, learning from these examples, essay, work hard and persevere in your efforts. Whether your intent is to produce a junior speech to benefit the Northfield community, sow a field to raise a crop or plant the seeds of the gospel, explore scripture to reach a deeper understanding of God, give a sermon to a receptive congregation, or whatever you choose to do, for what you produce may benefit others. The end result may seem small compared to the enormous effort exerted, but the energy is well spent if the creation is worthwhile. You cannot know ahead of time whether or not the product will help someone, but if you do not put in the efforts needed, no one else can ever be helped.
Bravo.